All right, it seems to be working for the time being. We'll see how long that lasts. All right, so let me get back to where I was. Now I have to reopen everything, of course. So we're going to take another effort at the chapter 7 problem set. All right, here we go. And then we can get back to 8. Let's see, it's not having a good day, is it? There we go. All right, what are 3 of the categories used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the construction of the CPI? Now, what they mean here, what it means here is that, wait, hold on 1 second. I did something wrong. I have, the solutions typed up here, but I want to go through it with you step by step rather than just reading it to you. So I'm going to print this thing off right now for reference. So in other words, the categories of the basket, the consumer basket that we use to construct the or calculate this CPI has several different categories, which actually I still have that right here. I think it's, yeah, here, the CPI. It should be, or it might be here. I don't remember if this is the right document, but for sure, if you're not sure, you can certainly always go look at the BLS website and they'll have everything there. Here it is. So basically, we're looking at these basic broad categories. For example, food, energy, apparel, all of these. But officially, the ones that are listed in the book, sorry, are food and beverages, housing, apparel. Now, you only needed 3, but I'm going to put them all in anyway. Transportation, medical services, recreation, education, and communication. Okay, those are all of them. The others are all subcategories of these. Okay, so these are the basic categories in which they use to construct the consumer basket, which is then used to calculate the CPI. Now, the base year, it's kind of an odd setup. They're basically using a range between 1982 and 1984 to act as the base year. Normally, it's a single year, but I'm not quite sure what the logic was behind using all of these years, but this is how they decided to set it up. And by definition, in the base year, the CPI is equal to 100. Okay, that way in any future year where prices are. Okay, in other words, if prices in a given year are 150, it's easy to determine that they're 50% higher than they were in the base year. Now, as long as inflation is positive, which it almost always is, in the years prior to the base year, the CPI is less than 100. All right, so in other words, if you go back before the base year, let's say the 1970s, the CPI would be smaller than 100. It's exactly 100 during the base year, and then afterwards it goes up. Okay, so here in these years, after the base year, the CPI is more than 100. All right, and again, but remember, that's assuming positive inflation. In a country like Japan or Switzerland that has actually had deflation, it isn't necessarily going to work this way. But typically, if you look at the CPI numbers, in fact, let me see if I can get the numbers. I thought I had that here somewhere. These are the categories, but I wanted to look at the actual index itself. This might be it right here. Let's check. Just so you can see, yeah. Oh, there we go. Perfect. This chart goes all the way back. Oh no, well, it goes back to just slightly before the base year started. You see how It doesn't reach 100 actually until we get to like right about here. All the months before that, and I see that it doesn't go back any further than that. But you notice how these CPIs are smaller than 100. Okay, so unfortunately, the series seems to only go back to 82. But the further back you go, the lower it will be. And once we get past that base year period, like right here, from that point on, it's always above 100. In fact, the last time I downloaded this in January, it's about 261. Since then, it's gone up probably into the 270s. And that means that we know that prices are about, they've gone up about 170% since the base year. All right. Suppose that the CPI is 250 at the end of 2019 and 260 at the end of 2020. So the rate of inflation is easy to figure out by calculating the percentage change in the two numbers. So in other words, if you start with 2019 CPI, it would be 2020 minus 2019 CPI over 2019 CPI. So you're going to get 262 minus 250 over 250, which is 12 over 250, which is 4.8%. So that means during that year, the inflation rate was 4.8%, meaning that consumer goods went up by 4.8%. Now, what are the two drawbacks to the methods used to compute CPI? Number one, well, actually, there's more than one again, but I'll list the ones that we have. The CPI does not measure all goods available to consumers. Okay, there are new goods in there that did not make their way into the basket. There are goods that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does not consider to be goods that a typical urban family of four would normally buy. And so things are left out. I don't know what percentage of all goods are left out, but some things are definitely not in there. The CPI cannot capture the impact of new goods because they haven't been incorporated into the basket yet. The CPI cannot capture the beneficial impact of improvements to goods. So in other words, when you buy a product built today, let's say you buy a car built in 2021, it's going to be a better car than the one built in 2011. If the price is the same, according to CPI, prices haven't changed, but in reality, you're getting your hands on a superior product. So in effect, the cost of living, I mean, technically it hasn't changed, but in reality, you're better off because the quality is higher. So the CPI can't really address the question of quality. So if we use it as a measure of standards of living, or how well can we afford to buy, it's not going to be as useful as it could be because it doesn't take into account the fact that even if prices don't change at all, we're still getting better quality goods over time. All right. And then, of course, the substitution bias, which means that the CPI does not or cannot capture the cost savings that result when consumers switch from more expensive goods to cheaper goods. And that's a big deal. In other words, if prices start to go up, you may be able to switch out for something different. So like, if for some reason chicken suddenly becomes much more expensive, we may be able to save money by buying pork. All right. And so with the CPI, the weights or the proportions that we spend on each good are fixed. So if we do substitute pork for chicken, it's not going to be able to pick up on that. And so it will give us the impression that our cost of living has gone up more than it really has. So in other words, all of these effects jointly give us the impression that prices are rising a little faster than they really are. And it's known. That's an understood problem with the CPI. It's not that much of a difference. It's not like it's way off. It's approximately 0.1% per year, or at least that's what economists believe. But still, it would be nice if it was better. In other words, that's still a bit much because a lot of contracts are based on the CPI. Now, the substitution bias, I've actually already explained that, so I'll just copy that here. All right, so yeah, I've already included that, so we can put that in there. And as I've already mentioned, the CPI tends to overstate the true cost of living, although not by all that much. They've been consistently improving this measure over the years, and so the difference isn't that great anymore. Now, the difference between nominal and real, a real price is adjusted for inflation, or you can say measured in base year prices, while a nominal price is not adjusted for inflation, which means it is measured in current year prices. Okay. So that takes care of that. And of course, it's not just prices. We see there we can make a distinction between nominal and real GDP, and we can make a distinction between nominal and real interest rates. And in principle, we can make a distinction between nominal and real for any variable that we want. But typically, that's where it is applied: prices, GDP, interest rates, because it makes a big difference in terms of purchasing power. Now, if a bank is paying 5% when the inflation rate is 1%, the inflation is eating up 1% of our purchasing power. So the real rate is approximately 5 minus 1, sorry, equals 4%. And what that means is our purchasing power is going up by about 4% instead of 5, because prices went up 1%. So the things we can buy have improved by 4%. All right, now as far as these are concerned, we have real and nominal prices. So the real price of the house, now in this case, the price of the house was 100 grand in 2000, and it's now 150. Let's say it's 2020. If the CPI in 2000 was 190, and it's 225 now, what is the real price of the house in 2020? So there's a couple of ways we could go about this. What we could do is convert the nominal price in 2020 what you can do is say, well, listen, what is the 2020 price adjusted for inflation compared with 2000? So we're basically going to pretend that 2000 is the base year. Okay, so what we're going to do is take the 2020 nominal price, and then we're going to multiply it by the ratio of the 2020 CPI over the 2000 CPI over the 2020 CPI. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to adjust prices so that we're treating 2000 in this example as if it were the base year, because that's when this first transaction was made. So what we're saying is that, while yes, the house sold for $150,000 in 2020 dollars, what would that have been in $2,000? So we're going to take the 150,000 and multiply it by the ratio of 190 over 225, and that's 126,667. So in 2000, the house cost 100,000. In 2020, the house cost 126,667 in $2,000. Okay, so that's what we're trying to capture. using the same dollars, the price actually has only gone up to 126,667. The rest of that increase was due to inflation. So while it may seem like the house gained in value quite a bit, and it did in nominal terms, it's not quite as much in real terms. Okay, so in other words, imagine you bought this house in 2000 and you sold it in 2020, and you hope to use this money to retire on, or at least help retire. Purchasing power wise, you've gained 26,667. In terms of nominal dollars, you've gained 50,000. Okay. All right. Now, that's part A. Now, B, nominal percentage increase. Okay. Now, nominal means actual current dollars. So that means 2020 nominal price minus 22,000 nominal price, all divided by 2,000 nominal price. So that means 150,000 minus 100,000 over 100,000 is 50,000 over 100,000, which is 0.50 or 50%. So yes, in terms of actual nominal dollars, it went up 50%. Okay, but in real terms, we'll have the 2020 real price or 2020 price. Sorry, the price in terms of $2,000. So the 2020 real price minus the 2000 real price over the 2000 real price, which equals 126,667 minus. Okay. $0.26667 or approximately 26.667%. Okay, so in real terms, in terms of purchasing power, the price went up quite a bit, but only about 26.67% rather than 50%, which you would get from nominal dollars. Okay. All right, so that's that. Let me just clean it up a little. And let me save it. Okay. There we go. All right. So I'll put this up there soon enough. All right, let's get back to 8. All right, now, what is going on here? I'd like to go back to Moodle for a second. And by the way, I'm happy to see that so far the recording hasn't stopped. That's kind of nice. I'm having a really tough week with technology. Let me tell you, everything I've touched this week has turned into crap as far as technology goes. And it never seems to stop. It's just one thing after another. And it's always the same things. Especially flash drives. They're so unreliable, it's beyond belief. But anyway, enough of that. Let's go back and get chapter 8. All right. So what we're going to do here is return to where we were. Now, remember what we were talking about here was potential GDP and the natural unemployment rate. But we're also looking at different schools of economic thought that try to explain how GDP is determined and how business cycles arise in the market. And we did manage to get through a few of them. We looked at the Keynesians, we looked at the Austrians, and we looked at the monetarists. But there's a couple more that we want to consider as well. They all have their own outlook on this. And so, hold on one second. All right, so what exactly is potential GDP? All right, potential GDP is what we could potentially produce or what we're capable of producing if nothing is going to waste. All right. So in other words, if all the factors of production, by which I mean land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, are being used as efficiently as possible, which is another way of saying that there's no cyclical unemployment, then we've reached a stage, a very happy stage, which is called full employment. Okay, no cyclical unemployment. All that remains of unemployment is structural and frictional, which are caused by other things besides the state of the economy. So that's considered to be full employment. Sometimes, whatever unemployment rate we're at this point, let's say that of the remaining unemployment, structural and frictional, that adds up to, let's say, 4%. Then some economists refer to that as the natural rate of unemployment, which simply means that that's the point below which it can't fall unless other changes are made, not just in the state of the economy. All right, so that level is where we'd ideally like to be. Of course it is. So what we're going to do, what we did do, is consider this idea of the production function. And we looked at a small example of a very small firm that makes soda. Okay, it's a bottling company of some kind. They make bottles of soda. And it's a very small factory. It has a lot of physical equipment, but there's a fixed amount. And there's also only so much room and so much land. The only thing that we can realistically change in the short run is labor. We can hire more workers if we need to produce more output. So how does that work though? So in the beginning, when we have no labor, in this case, we have no output, of course. When we bring in our first worker, that person is able to produce 3 units of the soda, 3 gallons a day. When we get to the second person, the output grows even faster because now we're starting to see specialization and division of labor. Each person can specialize in something that they're good at, and the output grows as a result. An example I've used in the past, which I think is really helpful, imagine yourself going to a McDonald's, and there's only one employee in the whole store. And that poor person has to run up there and take all the orders, and then they have to go back and cook the food, and then they have to come and bring it to your table. All right. And so that one individual has to do everything. And of course, their productivity is not going to be as high as it could be. So what do? The boss says, oh, well, the owner, I should say, says, maybe a second person would be helpful. So all of a sudden now with the second person, we can have one person who does nothing but take orders and bring food to the tables, and the other person can actually cook all the burgers and do nothing else all day. And so because of that, the output will grow very quickly because each person gets really good at what they're doing. Now, I mentioned this in regard to Henry Ford. How did Henry Ford make it possible for cars to become accessible to the middle class? Exactly what you're seeing here. Mass production, specialization, and division of labor. He had his factories organized so that rather than one person or a small team of people building each car separately, instead they set up an assembly line so that each person would do exactly one thing all day. One person would put the body on the assembly line, and somebody else would put on the tires, and somebody else would paint it. And so everybody would specialize and they would get really good at something. And so because of that, he was able to churn out so many cars that they were very, very inexpensive and accessible for the first time to the middle class. In fact, in the early days, at least, In order to keep cost at an absolute minimum, he only used black paint. He figured that would be the most popular color. And he said, um, he famously said, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. Eventually, when it became possible, he started adding other colors as well. But in the early days, the point of this was to get as many cars done as possible. And so by having to have multiple colors to choose from, that would have slowed down everything. So he was really serious about getting as many cars built as possible in a short time. And that kind of revolutionized manufacturing as we know it. And that's when suddenly it became possible for the middle class to have cars and other items that had previously only been reserved for the very well off. A lot of things we take for granted were in the past terribly, terribly expensive. And so now it's like anybody basically who has a full-time job can afford to buy a new car. But in those days, you had to be really crazy rich to actually have a car. And so the reason why that's not true anymore, among other things, is because of Henry Ford's innovations. And here the same thing is happening. Now, when you get that third person in there, if you notice, the jump in output from person number 0 to 1 is 3. All right. So that first person shows up for work, they're able to add 3 extra units of soda to the total output. The second person, because we're now seeing some specialization going on, adds 5 more units to the total output. The third person adds 4, which is still good, but maybe not quite as good as person number 2. All right. So the specialization is still helping a lot, but maybe not quite as much as with the second person. And if you're thinking about McDonald's again, now maybe with 3 people, you've got 2 people cooking and 1 people taking the orders, let's say. So the people who are cooking have to share the same equipment and the same space. So their increase in productivity maybe is not quite what it was when the second person came along. So you can see the pattern now that's developing. Once we get past person 2, every time we add more labor, the extra output goes up much more slowly. And in fact, it reaches a point where with the 5th person, the output doesn't go up at all. Now, does that mean that 5th worker is a terrible worker? No. It means that there's only so much room in this place. There's only so much equipment. People are standing around waiting for each other to finish before they can do their jobs. And in fact, if we try to squeeze in a 6th person, output actually goes down because now they're basically getting in each other's way. So this process that you're seeing here can be illustrated with the production possibilities frontier. All right, sorry, the what am I saying? No, sorry. That's a different chapter. They're illustrating this with the total product of labor curve. Sorry. Yes, Fernando.
So then, to that back to that chart, then would it change if, um, like when we were talking about earlier that realistically we could only like have so much labor, but the
Right.
land. So if we would have changed the land, like increasing it, then the
Oh,
then the inputs would be better, right?
they would. As a matter of fact, suppose that we reproduce this chart after the company buys more equipment and expands the size of the factory. Then all of the numbers in the second column would be higher than they are here. But you would still eventually run into the case where the output is growing more slowly. So that part wouldn't change, but you would have more output at each level of labor because there's more equipment and there's more space. And it might take longer to reach this point where the output is growing more slowly, but the basic pattern doesn't change. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because what you could actually visualize here is that the entire curve would actually shift in an upward direction. Okay, what would that look like? Let's see. Let me do this on a separate page. Let me introduce a new slide here, because yes, you're exactly right. With more land or more equipment or more whatever, you would see that instead of, oh, okay. This is still the total product of labor. This is the actual quantity of labor. So instead of something like this, you might see something like this. Okay, so it goes up at every level of output, but you do see the same basic shape hasn't changed. Let's call it TP2 and TP1. That's right. And what can cause this to happen is increased resources. Shift the curve to TP2. So it's the same situation, only we get more output for each quantity of labor. Yes, Fernando.
I know this is only an example, but then if that's the case, then how can the business, like, instead of like going into that to that downward at the end,
Mhm.
how can the business continue
Well,
excelling?
they're not once they get past here, no, they're never going to produce this amount of output. I mean, from here on, they're not going to hire any more people. What will determine where they are along here is the output of the price at which they can sell the product compare with the labor costs. So in other words, the number of people they hire will depend on how much does it cost to pay them compared to how much can we sell the soda for. But no matter what's going on, they're never going to go past this point, because it would be insane, because you're paying people to reduce your output. So you know that you'll never get into this portion of the curves. But prior to that, they could operate at any point in these curves, depending, like I said, on how much it costs to pay people to do this versus how much you can sell it for. So let's just make up an example here. Suppose that, let's say that it's $10 per unit of labor. So each of these costs me, let's say to hire 3 workers, it's $30. And the sodas can be sold for $20. Let's say these are, this isn't like a small bottle. This is like a keg of soda, let's say. And so if you were to actually calculate these costs, if I've done this correctly, there's going to come, oh boy. All right, let's keep going. I hope I've chosen the numbers wisely. Maybe not. I guess this is okay. I'll tell you, see, here's what we're looking for. We're looking for, yeah, this is 160. We're looking for the biggest gap between the revenues. These are the revenues now. And these are the costs of production. So the gap between the two is equal to our profits. And so it looks to me like this is the place we want to be, because here's where we're making $240 on this. Whereas if we jump up one more level, our profits go down to 230. Whereas at this level, our profits are only 210. So this is where we want to be. We'd hire 4 workers and we'd make a profit of $240. If that's what it costs to make to pay the workers, and that's how much we can sell the soda for. So you're looking for the area where you have the maximum spread between the revenues and the cost of production. And here you notice when we don't get any more extra output by hiring the 5th worker, naturally enough, our profits fall because we're paying more people to produce the same revenues. And then of course down here, nobody wants to be down here. So yeah, so the production itself, though, we can make important claims about it without knowing how much we can sell the soda for. But ultimately, we do have to compare the cost of producing the soda with the revenues from selling it before we decide how much labor to hire. Okay, but one thing we do know is that we're never going to go into the zone here where the output is actually shrinking as we hire more workers. Okay, now, anyway, all of this collectively is referred to as the law of diminishing returns. Okay, this is one of the most important concepts in economics. Anytime you try to increase a variable resource where other resources are fixed, this is always going to be the case. Now, the classic example of this, which I don't remember if I mentioned last time, something you've experienced yourself, is studying. Why do I say that? Well, for example, here's my classic example, studying. Why do I say that? Would a student be better off studying 1 hour a day for 10 days or 10 hours for 1 day? What do you think about that? Yes, Fernando.
The student will be way better studying for 1 hour for 10 days.
Yes. And why is that? What's the difference? It's still 10 hours, isn't it? Why would that be?
Well, it would be because that even for a short amount of period of time, the consistency will still improve like the muscle memory of learning whatever topic the student's learning or studying.
Okay. And then Devin, do you want to say something?
I was gonna say 1 hour for 10 days.
Right. And why is that?
It's because it will stay in your long-term memory bank.
Okay. Well, in economics terms, what we're getting at here is studying 10 hours for 1 day is inefficient because as the day progresses, learning will increase at a progressively decreasing rate. In other words, what's going to happen is you're experiencing the law of diminishing returns because let's face it, let's say you decide I'm going to study all day on Sunday for my Monday exam. Okay, fine, you've got 10 hours. But what starts to happen as the day wears on? In the beginning, you're very productive. And then all of a sudden you realize you're getting a little tired and you're getting hungry and you're getting a little tired of studying. And so what's happening is that the productivity of, let's say, the 5th hour is lower than the productivity of the 1st hour and is falling with each additional hour. On the other hand, if you only study for an hour, your productivity should be pretty high throughout that entire hour. I mean, everyone should be able to concentrate for an hour without getting tired or hungry, let's face it. So I would suggest that 10 hours, 1 day at a time would be more efficient because you're getting 10 hours at which you're at your maximum productivity. Whereas here, you've got a lot of time in there where you're not at your maximum productivity. And in fact, psychologists have actually proven that if you try to study too much all in one shot, the last couple of hours can actually be counterproductive. You might actually have negative learning. It's possible for this to happen. So what you're experiencing if you try to study all day is the law of diminishing returns. You know perfectly well that the hours in the evening are not as good as the hours that you had in the morning. So you'd be better off breaking it up into 10 equal pieces where each time your productivity is at its maximum. And you all know this intuitively. You just didn't think about it in terms of diminishing returns, did you? No, economists have an answer for everything, by the way. These graphs seem very abstract and all, and they are, but they seek to explain just about every type of behavior. As long as you are allocating resources somehow, economists feel free to explain how that works because that's their area, okay? Anytime you do any kind of activity where resources are involved, there's a potential economic explanation to what you're doing. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Economists have an answer for everything. All right, now, technological advances. Now, in addition to having more resources, what if our soda factory buys equipment that is more technologically advanced? So in other words, we don't have more equipment, but the equipment we do have is more sophisticated. It's more powerful. it can produce more soda in the same length of time. Well, what's going to happen is exactly the same thing. The curve will shift up because our labor is more productive. All right. Now, not that the laborers are any quicker than they used to be, but the machinery that they're using is quicker and more efficient. It's like, imagine if you worked in a Starbucks and the blenders that you have are really old and they're really small and they're hard to use. And so all of a sudden Starbucks says, you know, you guys, here we bought you some brand new blenders, which are much more powerful and faster. Well, you're going to get more smoothies done in the same length of time, just because the machinery is more efficient. Maybe somebody invented a brand new blender or something that they're taking advantage of. So this shift can occur not just because of more resources, but also because of technological advances. And in fact, this is one of the main sources of our standard of living growing, because as technology improves, productivity improves, and we can have more of everything with the same amount of resources. And so that's, of course, what we hope for. So technology is helping us in many different ways. It's not just giving us cooler things to play with. It's making productivity higher so that we can have more of everything, which is, of course, exactly what we want. There's never going to come a time when you say, oh, please stop increasing. I don't need any more goods and services. No, it doesn't work that way, does it? Would you ever say no to more stuff? No. There's no such person who doesn't want more things and better things. More is always better, don't you think?
I think it depends.
Of course, it depends on what it is. Like more candy is not good for you necessarily, but more, let's say more, I don't know, more video games. What if they become cheaper because the chips are getting faster? Or what if you can have more fancy food, like you're used to eating burgers all the time, and suddenly steak becomes cheaper because of productivity. That's a good thing for everyone. So, but anyway, and it's not just the quantity, it's also the quality of life that improves because of this. All right. So I'll tell you what, why don't we quickly jump back before we carry on with this, the labor market. We're going to treat labor as a commodity, just like any other good in the economy. In other words, you can think of a supply of labor and a demand for labor, just like you can have a supply and demand for other goods like coffee or, you know, cars or whatever. The difference here is that the price of labor would be the wages that we have to pay people to work. But the logic is exactly the same. Okay. But before we get into that, remember, we missed a couple of these videos. We didn't quite get around to the last two theories. We haven't quite seen the real business cycle theory yet. So let's take a look at that one. It's a little bit different. This is a new, compared to the other three, this is a very new development. The monetarists really got rolling in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. The Keynesians, that really got rolling in the 30s, and the Austrians were around the same period as the Keynesians, maybe a little later. Real business cycle theory really only got started, if I remember correctly, in the 90s. So it's a relatively new theory about what generates business cycles. And I think you'll find it kind of interesting. All right, so let me just fire this off to you. All right, let's check this out.
Real business cycle theory is about negative supply shocks. That word real in the name, don't contrast it with the word phony, but rather contrast it with monetary. Real business cycles are not about monetary policy. Mostly they're about negative supply shocks. Now, the nice thing about real business cycle theory is that it actually explains most business cycles in the history of the human race. Consider earlier economies where, say, 80% of GDP was agriculture. What then could be the negative shock? Well, imagine a whole year of bad rainfall and then a very bad harvest. That would mean lower output for almost all of the economy. It would mean people have less to eat. It might even mean more malnutrition. And that would be a very bad macroeconomic event. That's just the simplest example of real business cycle theory. Real business cycle theory needs to be modified for more modern economies, which are more diversified. So what would be an example? Consider America in the year 1973. What was the negative shock then? A much higher price of oil. OPEC, the oil exporting cartel, raised the price of its oil to American buyers. Now, oil is an input into the production of many goods and services, like airplane trips, or building automobiles, or bathtub rubber duckies. So you have higher production costs. That means less will be produced, probably fewer workers will be hired, and overall incomes will be lower. Those initial negative shocks will work their way through the American economy, and that will mean successive negative shocks for other parts of the economy, even if they don't use oil, and that ends up leading to a recession. Real business cycle theory also can apply to the present day. Consider the economy of Brazil, where GDP has declined by more than 5% over the last 2 years. What have been the negative shocks? First, falling commodity prices. Brazil exports a lot of commodities like soybeans and cotton and coffee and minerals. Those commodities are bringing in lower prices on world markets, and that means lower incomes for a lot of Brazilians. Second, bad policy. The behavior of the Brazilian government has been erratic and unpredictable, and this has increased the level of perceived risk in the Brazilian economy. So to graph a real business cycle, what does that look like? Well, in our basic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, it's pretty simple. The long run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the left, and you can see that means a lower level of output. Over the medium term, due to propagation, it also may be that the aggregate demand curve shifts back into the left, and that, of course, will make the problem worse. But again, the fundamental event is simply the shifting back into the left of the aggregate supply curve. So what are the solutions when you have a problem based in real business cycle theory? Well, first thing you can do is try to avoid the problem in the first place. If the risk is having an oil price which is too high, try to have invested in the first place in some energy alternatives. Second, ask yourself, what can you do to make your economy more flexible so it can adjust to the negative supply shock more quickly? All of those responses will help limit the costs of having a negative real business cycle. So what are the problems in real business cycle theory? There are at least two. First, it doesn't explain all business cycles. A lot of business cycles do have to do with monetary policy, banking, and credit, rather than the supply side of the economy. A second problem with real business cycle theory, it's not always good on explaining why unemployment is so high over the course of many business cycles. If you imagine a negative shock hitting the economy, well, why don't workers just take lower wages and stay at work? And to explain those employment effects, often we need to supplement real business cycle theory with other accounts of business cycles. So to sum up, real business cycle theory is a really good theory for many cases, but it leaves many others fundamentally unexplained.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks.
All right, well, that's cool. So be careful with economics. The word real can have different meanings. They're explained to us here that real simply means not to do with money. In other words, when they say real, they're talking about actual production of goods and services, where the monetarists are talking about money. So what they're saying is that when there are shocks to the economy, like in the Egyptian case, the floods and all the disasters, and in the case of the U.S. economy in the 70s, the sudden increase in oil prices, those are real shocks to the economy, as they're called. The word shock simply means a negative impact from a change in a variable. Although the word shock is designed to, make it clear that this is not a good thing. So when they say the word shock, they're talking about negative impacts on the economy from different outcomes, like rising oil prices, or in the case of Egypt, again, the poor weather. But they are making the case here that not all business cycles are caused by shocks to the real economy, that sometimes the problem really is printing too much money and other non or financial impacts. So the thing is, these theories really can't be thought of as each one individually being completely correct or completely wrong. They all maybe can be thought of as capturing different aspects of real business, how business cycles behave in the real world. It's not likely that any of these theories captures everything. They all have interesting insights about what's going on with business cycles. So anyway, but of course, depending on who's in power, they will follow along with the recommendations of these different schools of thought. So in some periods in time, we've had very monetarist administrations, and in other times we've had very Keynesian administrations. I'm not so sure if we've ever had more real business cycle theory running or in charge of government policy, but each one has its own approach and they focus on different things. So anyway, now the next video is more about a specific case, a specific business cycle from the late 2000s. Now, in the late 2000s, there was a housing crisis. For the first time since the Depression, housing prices actually went down, possibly in some cases quite a bit, due to a lot of factors like people speculating on the housing market by buying houses they couldn't afford and then trying to flip them. And other issues arose as well, so that in the late 2000s, we had a really nasty recession, which is sometimes called the credit crisis or the housing crisis. And so in that case, the Fed had to step in and do some extraordinary things that they had never done before, like bailing out banks and taking their bad investments off their hands and buying them off the banks. And all kinds of emergency measures had to be used to keep the economy running, because otherwise we might have found ourselves in another depression. It was that serious, but luckily the Fed was able to get the policy they used was very effective. So in this video, they're going to talk about this. And by the way, there's a movie out there about this whole period in time, which you may or may not have seen. I don't remember what year it was made. Let me write it down here somewhere for you. I'll put it in the chat room. The movie that, if you are interested in this, is called The Big Short. Okay. I don't remember. Let me see if I can find out what year it was made. It was around, it wasn't too much afterward. It has a lot of, by the way, it has a lot of big name stars in it too. Hold on, let me see what I can find. All right, let's see. It's not letting me see my icons.
By taking a few practice questions,
hold on.
or
I'm getting very annoyed with my computer here. There we go. Why is it so hard? Why won't it show me these on the bottom? It's just unbelievable. All right, let's just do a quick research on that movie. Just some of the details.
Great movie choice, by the way.
Oh, you have seen it. Okay, good. The Big Short, but it's specifically about the credit or housing crisis of the late 2000s. There it is, 2015. It's all about what happened. And yeah, there's some really big names in this movie, like Brad Pitt and Christian Bale and Michael Scott from Dunder Mifflin. No, Steve Carell and Ryan Gosling. And so they did a really good job. Often when movies are made about financial events, it's hard for them to make it understandable for the general public, but they really did a very good job, I thought, in keeping you informed about what's happening without overwhelming you with details. And so it's also just a very interesting movie. There's a lot of drama going on. And of course, that it's all real, which is the scary part. So And there's also a lot of intrigue and backstabbing and unethical behavior. So what else could you ask for in a Hollywood movie about Wall Street? Well, not specifically Wall Street, but the entire housing industry. And so yes, and it was written by Michael Lewis, who wrote this amazing book called Liar's Poker, which is about his experiences on Wall Street in the 80s, where he explained what the culture is like. And it wasn't a very pretty picture, that's for sure. So you may have heard his name before, Michael Lewis. But if you ever get a chance to read the book Liar's Poker, I think you'll like it a lot. This was also one of his books, and it was turned into a movie, and it's all about that crisis. And it does kind of make you wonder how something like this could actually happen. You wonder, this is the one time you want government regulations to be working properly, or at least them overseeing what's happening. And of course, it would be the one time that they drop the ball and let all this stuff happen. So anyway, so we're going to watch this video, which is a brief look at the same crisis. And let's see if I can find it. There we go. Hold on. Here we go. They're calling it the Great Recession here. All right, hold on. Let me just get that fired off to you. And here we go. Yes, great movie. I recommend it to everyone. Even economics major or not, it doesn't matter. Everyone will like this movie. All right, so all right, let's watch the video. Okay, let's go. Here we go.
So let's consider in more detail 4 major theories of business cycles: Keynesian theory, real business cycle theory, monetarist approaches, and also the Austrian School of Economics. One way to get a better grasp on these differing theories is to see how they might attempt to explain a very specific historical event. And for that, I have in mind the Great Recession of 2008. I'm reminded of the old analogy about 4 blind men grasping an elephant. The elephant is a big, complex creature, and in this context, you can think of the Great Recession, or indeed the economy more broadly, as being the elephant. And we as economists, we're like blind men, we're grasping the elephant. Some of us are touching the trunk, some of us are touching the tail, some of us are touching the leg. We see, feel, and process different aspects of the elephant. And it's not a question of one person's perspective being correct and the others being wrong, but rather to understand the elephant, to grasp the Great Recession. What's important to do is to bring together these multiple and different perspectives. So what would Keynesian economics say about the Great Recession? Well, a core Keynesian idea is the shortfall in aggregate demand. When there's a shortfall in aggregate demand, there are then declines in output and in employment, and that's when a recession ensues. So for Keynes, the key components of aggregate demand were consumption, plus investment, plus government, and indeed all of those were falling. Why was consumption falling? Well, the American economy had a housing bubble. Home prices were going up, everyone was happy, spending and borrowing a lot of money. But when that bubble burst, people then felt poorer and more in debt, and then consumer spending fell. What about investment? Well, here there was a problem with the banks. Banks held a lot of mortgages, but when the real estate bubble burst, those mortgage securities, those home loans, they were worth a lot less. A lot of banks were either insolvent or near insolvency, and they just wanted to hold on to their cash. That meant less credit creation, and it eventually meant less business investment. So that component of aggregate demand fell as well. Finally, what about government? Well, you have less output, you have less employment. Governments are taking in less money in the form of taxes, and that had a negative impact on government spending. So all these key components of aggregate demand were falling, and as Keynesian economics predicts, well, you ended up with a pretty big recession.
Precisely.
Okay, so what might real business cycle theorists say about the Great Recession? Well, one possibility would be to go back a little further in time and ask why the American economy had so many structural problems to begin with. And if you look at the data on productivity, in fact, the rate of growth in American productivity, it slowed down dramatically. So there was something wrong with the supply side of the economy. So maybe the Keynesians are right that circa 2008, 2009, there was a big problem with aggregate demand. But where did that problem come from? It came from the fact that we were ultimately creating less wealth. Imagine it being in America where people were spending and borrowing as if productivity were growing at about 3% a year, but in reality, productivity was only growing at about 1% a year. So a more fundamental explanation from the point of view of a real business cycle theorist is to focus on the problems, the structural issues in the American economy, even before that 2008 crash came along. Real business cycle theorists also would look at the period of recovery and ask, why was recovery so slow and so painful? Some of that was the continuation of a low rate of productivity growth, but also there was a lot of policy uncertainty. In some cases, taxes went up or subsidies were applied in such a way that individuals had an incentive not to re-enter the labor force as quickly as possible. Okay, so what about the monetarists? Well, the monetarists in some ways take the side of the Keynesians. That is, they see aggregate demand as the big problem in the Great Recession. But they talk much more about monetary policy.
The Fed.
And here I'm thinking of one offshoot of monetarism in general. It's sometimes called market monetarism. The market monetarists look at 2008, just when trouble was starting to break. Now, according to monetarism, you want the Federal Reserve to be maintaining a pretty constant flow of nominal expenditure through the economy so that aggregate demand doesn't fall. Trouble was about to break loose in 2008, but at the Federal Reserve, a lot of people in the central bank didn't know this. They were still worried about rates of price inflation being too high.
Isn't good.
So the Federal Reserve did not perform the kind of expansionary monetary policy that would have been called for.
Let's go back to quantity.
So in the market monetarist view, yes, there was an aggregate demand problem. Mostly we can blame the Federal Reserve System.
GDP is falling.
And the key moment there is, say, fall of 2008, when the Fed should have been much more expansionary. Okay, so what might the Austrian School of Economics have to say about the Great Recession? Well, like some of the real business cycle theorists, the Austrians want to go back a bit further in time and ask, what are the historical roots of the problems of 2008, 2009? Some of the Austrians have been very critical of Fed policy. So starting at around 2001, credit conditions were fairly loose, interest rates were quite low, and a lot of stimulus was given to credit and also to housing markets. And it wasn't just the central bank. There were actually a lot of different government programs to encourage mortgages, guarantee mortgages, and of course the American tax system also encourages borrowing to buy more homes. So you have this overinvestment and indeed malinvestment in real estate. And according to the Austrian point of view, well, a lot of that came from government in the first place. So the Austrians admit there was a housing bubble, but they want to take a deeper perspective and ask, why did the housing bubble get so bad to begin with? Some of the Austrians also, when they look at the length and severity of the recession, they cite some of the factors that the real business cycle theorists have talked about. So putting all of those perspectives together, when you ask the question, what are the solutions to the problems the American economy has faced? There is indeed some need to choose across differing schools of thought. The Keynesians and the monetarists have different recipes for addressing aggregate demand, whereas the Austrians and real business cycle theorists, their concerns are really quite different, and very often they focus more on simply letting markets adjust. But putting aside solutions, if we're just trying to understand how did this all happen? What was the entire series of events? I would go back to this metaphor of the elephant. Economies and macroeconomies, they're very complex. And we as economists, we are operating somewhat blind. But we can grasp different sides or different angles of economies, like the blind man can grasp the elephant. But it's not enough just to touch or talk about one part of what happened. So when we put together all of these differing and multiple perspectives, that actually gives us a deeper and wiser understanding of what the Great Recession was all about.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice.
All right. Well, that was interesting. I thought the analogy of having the four blindfolded economists touching different parts of the elephant, and each one is describing a different part of the elephant and getting like the impression that the whole elephant is like that. So that's why some of them are feeling the trunk and some of them are feeling the tail and some of them are feeling the legs, and they're all contributing their understanding to the, you know, the whole elephant, which is business cycle theory. But none of them has a complete picture. Of course, they can't. It would be impossible. So the problem then is that what do policymakers do, though? Who do they follow? Which outlook do they want to follow? Which one do they have the most confidence in? And, you know, so it's a very tricky thing to do, to try to listen to just one of the schools, because they're not always all correct. So this is why policymaking is pretty difficult to do properly. Now, they did mention the Fed. You know, the Fed had no way of knowing that this was going to happen. So, you know, when it started to become an issue, they did start lowering interest rates, and they did what they had to do to get the economy out of this nasty recession. But I mean, some of these schools are kind of blaming the Fed, but I don't think that was the problem. The problem was that it was just so easy to buy a house, whether there was any prospect of paying it back or not. In fact, if you watch that movie, The Big Short, there was one woman who was saying how she was a dancer or something, and that she'd bought 3 houses because the credit conditions were so easy that almost anyone could just buy a house. The banks almost didn't care if anyone could actually pay the mortgages or not. So they were handing out mortgages right and left. And so naturally enough, people are buying houses because they think they can flip them for a profit. And what is created then is something called a speculative bubble, where prices go up and up and up, way more than you would expect just in the growth of the population. And all of a sudden, when the whole thing collapses, everybody loses a bundle of money. As a matter of fact, there was an interesting historical event, which was probably one of the first bubbles that ever took place. And in fact, maybe it would be fun to find a video about this. In the early, let's say, 17th century in the Netherlands, there was a bubble centered around tulip bulbs. And all of a sudden, tulip bulb prices started going through the roof. People started buying them like crazy. And they would speculate on tulip bulbs by buying them, hoping to sell them to somebody else for a profit. And the prices got to absurd levels. And then all of a sudden, the whole bubble collapsed. And a lot of people lost an awful lot of money. And so this is a good example of a speculative bubble. The housing market was becoming a speculative bubble. People were gambling that housing prices would go up forever. So they would borrow a bunch of money and buy houses and hang on to them, hoping to sell them at a profit. And when the whole thing collapsed, many of them lost enormous amounts of money. In fact, you know what, let me go see if I can find, I think you'll find this interesting. It is, oh, wait a minute. You know what? I think I may have already added that to one of my lists. Let me see if I can quickly grab it. Since we're talking about bubbles, which you may not have heard about before, basically it means that the price of an asset is rising very quickly, way beyond what economic fundamentals suggest it should be doing. Like in the case of housing, you expect housing prices to go up because the population is growing, but it shouldn't go up nearly as fast as it was in the 90s. That was due to speculation. So let me see if I can find that right now. I think you'll find this very interesting. Oh, here it is. I did save it. Yay. It's called Tulip Mania. And where did I put it? Oh, no. Now I can't find it. I have so many wonderful videos here that we may not have time to watch. I thought I put that in here. Oh, no. There it is. Yes. All right. So we're going to watch this right now just because it's an interesting historical event that actually took place. And it was one of the first speculative bubbles in history. And you'll start to wonder about people when you see this, like, how could they get so carried away? But it does happen from time to time. And the housing market in the late 2000s was just like this. So let me send this to you right now. And here we go. Let's check this out.
The future happens when we explore new frontiers. Gemini is the future of finance. Invest in over 30 cryptos like Bitcoin, industry-leading security and insurance. Invest better.
Today, you can buy several tulips for a couple of dollars. In 1637, you could buy every house on your street for a couple of tulips. The year is 1637, right in the middle of the Dutch Golden Age. This is the era of names such as Rembrandt, Christian Huygens, and Johannes Vermeer. And even though it was in a golden age, the Dutch Republic was a new country, founded only half a century ago when it revolted against the Spanish Empire and started the 80 Years' War. This golden age was spurred in a large part due to the Dutch Republic's invention of early capitalism. And it is here, in Amsterdam, that the first company was founded, the first stock exchange created, and as we will see over the course of this series, it's the place where the first financial bubble burst. This is the story of tulip mania. But what even is a financial bubble? For us economic nerds, this is easy to understand. For the rest of you, here is a short example. Let's say you have a Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin costed you $100. A little later, you sell that Bitcoin for $150, earning you a profit of $50. That evening, you meet with your friends and you tell them all about how you just made $50 with Bitcoin. Your friends, of course, want the same profit, so they buy a bunch of Bitcoins, hoping to sell it later at an even higher price. After a week, they sell each of their Bitcoin for $200. And then new people come in to buy Bitcoin, hearing of all this profit being made. Over time, more and more people come in. Each person is betting they will be able to sell at a higher price to the next person. But eventually, you run out of buyers. You run out of the next person. And then the price goes down. It crashes. This is an economic bubble. And like all bubbles, they must eventually burst. Tulips originally came from Persia and traveled via the Ottoman trade to Western Europe in the 16th century. Tulips come in a variety of colors, and they rapidly became prized above all other flowers. The Dutch Republic saw the rise of a new middle class, and these merchants and traders were willing to pay large sums of money for the newest, the latest, the most spectacularly colored tulips. Each year, new varieties were cultivated. In particular, there was one type of tulip that was prized above all other types of tulips. This tulip had dark-colored stripes or flames on a light background. But what is interesting is that they did not get this color due to the flower's genetics, but because of a virus. But this is the early 17th century, and the field of genetics wouldn't exist for another 200 years. This meant that as a tulip grower, you could never be sure whether you had an ordinary tulip or an extremely valuable flaming tulip. This made tulips a risky investment. Tulip traders usually had their own private garden, but there were no professional tulip traders. As far as I could find out, none of them were. They all had a day job, and tulip growing and trading was a side business for them, a hobby. These men belonged to a new middle class, which was just forming in the Dutch Republic, thanks to the Dutch East India Company and the vast wealth it brought with it. But just because tulips were a hobby didn't mean they were amateurs. In fact, these men knew a lot about this plant, and growing the best one was a serious hobby, not just a casual one. And by the 1620s, a beautiful new flower had emerged, the Semper Augustus. God, don't you just love that name? Anyway, the Semper Augustus was owned by one man, and he was crafty. He knew that if he sold the offspring of this tulip, it was only a matter of time before his customers would grow more, and then he would have competitors, meaning that he would have to lower his price to compete with competitors. So he did what most companies would do in this situation, create a monopoly, meaning that he was the only one who was able to sell the Semper Augustus. But how did he do it? Because if he sold his tulip, his customers would automatically be able to grow more of them. Well, he created a special kind of contract with very specific terms. First, you weren't even allowed to sell your tulip without the express permission of the original owner. And secondly, you weren't allowed to sell any of the offspring from the tulip bulb either. As you might imagine, many traders did not honor this contract, and many an angry merchant went to the Dutch notary office to file an official complaint. Records of these complaints can still be found in the archives of many Dutch cities to this day, and it is through these records that we know just how much tulips were worth during that time. Even though not all merchants honored the deal, most of them did. This way, he was assured that he could control how many of his precious Semper Augustus were being sold, and as a result, the price went up. By 1623, the price for a single Augustus Semper tulip bulb was worth 1,000 guilders. By the end of 1625, that price had risen to 3,000 guilders. To put this into perspective, a skilled artisan, such as a carpenter, would earn about 300 guilders per year. So that meant that by 1625, a carpenter would have to work 10 whole years, not spend any of that on food or a house or anything. And then after 10 years, he would finally be able to take all his money to a tulip trader and buy a single bulb. And that's without the price going up even further than it already did. And to put this in modern day perspective, an average carpenter in the Netherlands earns about 30,000 euros per year, meaning this bulb would cost about 300,000 euros. 300,000 euros for a single bulb. Because my audience comes from a variety of countries, here is how much it would have cost in other popular countries among my viewers.
We're so excited. We just got a Home Chef box in, and one of our favorite recipes, margarita chicken
With garlic, Parmesan.
A single tulip of the most valuable breed could sell for 10 times the average yearly wage. In the 1630s, the tulip trade started to change, and one change led to another until eventually the whole thing had become unsustainable and the entire tulip trade would eventually collapse. So let's look how this started. First of all, a system of colleges developed across the main towns in the Dutch Republic, each composed of a core of small traders. They met at a specific inn, usually 2 or 3 times per week, and usually in the evening, as most traders had a day job. Outsiders were welcome, but only through an introduction. Deals took place with the mediation of 1 or 2 neutral observers, and all sales were sealed with a payment of a small surcharge called the wijnkoop, or a wine purchase, of about 2.5%. This 2.5% was spent on food, tobacco, wine, and other luxury goods at the inn. But there was a problem. While there was a large variety of bulbs, the problem was that they couldn't sell as many or as often as they wanted to. Tulips don't grow very fast. You can't harvest every autumn like most crops. In fact, it could take several years before a tulip is able to bloom for the first time. So until it bloomed, you weren't sure what your tulip was going to look like. And so the first change happened. A new type of contract started circulating, a futures contract. Now, some of you are scratching your head, wondering what the hell a future contract is. Well, a future is a type of contract where the buyer purchases a product and then the seller delivers that product once it's ready. So in the case of tulips, you would sign a contract for a tulip bulb, but you don't take possession of the bulb just yet because you wait until it flowers. Well, since you have a contract which states that the owner of the contract is the owner of the tulip, you can simply sell that contract. After all, a futures contract states that the bearer of the contract is also the owner. So give that contract to someone else, and now they are the owner of the tulip. Simple. But why would you buy a tulip if you don't even know whether it is the one you wanted? Well, a future has the advantage that as the buyer, you can usually purchase the product at a lower price in exchange for taking extra risk. As the seller, you reduce your risk by selling early, and so you are assured to make a profit. Maybe not as much as you would otherwise make, but hey, that's why you're selling futures anyway. You don't want to take that risk. So at this point, in 1634, people had slips of paper stating the ownership of a tulip bulb. Remember how I said earlier that traders would only buy and sell tulips while they were in bloom, so they could assess the quality. Well, with a slip of paper, you could much more easily trade tulip bulbs. You no longer needed to wait until a flower bloomed. You could now sell it at any time you wanted. And this is the second major change in the tulip trade. Before, tulip trading was highly seasonal. People would come in, they would look at the tulip, and then the flower would be sold. But now you could trade it at any time you wanted. So if a particular brand of tulips generally looks good, then you'd pay whatever the price of that particular brand of tulip is at that moment. This makes sense. If a particular breed was worth 10 guilders at the time, you could buy that breed knowing that this flower was probably around 10 guilders anyway, as breeds don't vary that much in appearance. That makes sense. We do the same now when we purchase online. We don't go to the warehouse to check if the smartphone you want to buy is really as good as we've been told. We simply trust that a smartphone is a certain quality and that it is worth a certain amount of money. Simple. Well, not really. But before we delve further into the pit of financial collapse, let's have some trivia to break up this video. Tulips would often be named after the owner or a city, with words added to suggest high quality, such as general or admiral. And as the price of tulips increased, so did the extravagance of naming them. In order to make their bulb sound ever more impressive, there were tulips such as General of Generals of Gouda, because one general wasn't good enough, apparently. As someone working in marketing, I can respect this type of naming system. Okay, so people were now trading slips of paper stating the ownership of a bulb. And as a result, people were now trading more and more. Prices were soaring at this point. And this led to the third major change. When people heard of the insane amounts of profits the tulip traders were making, they wanted in on the action. So many new traders entered the tulip market that it changed everything about the tulip trade. And as prices grew, more and more people who knew nothing about tulips wanted to get in on the profitable tulip trade. So people who knew very little about tulips started buying tulips with the idea that they could sell them for a profit in the future without ever wanting to own a tulip themselves or plan on making a
Okay, you know what? I didn't realize this was so long. So I'll tell you what, everyone, let's stop right here. We'll pick it up next time. We'll watch this video together, the rest of it, because it's very interesting. As you can see, it's very exciting, but we still got 10 more minutes to go. So I don't want to hold you up all day. So I'll tell you what, why don't we, next time we'll start by watching the rest of this video, and then we'll carry on with the rest of chapter 8 and we'll start chapter 9. Okay. So, but I don't want to miss the rest of this, but I don't want you to be late for something else. So we'll stop here. We're about 11 minutes into the video, and then we'll pick it up from there, and then we'll go over it, and then we'll pick it up again with chapter 8, okay? So I know some of you are getting a little nervous. You're looking at your watches like, what's going on here? But yeah, so we'll carry on next time, okay? Does that sound good to everyone? All right, good. All right, so I'll see you all on Friday, okay?
Thank you.
All right, see you next time.
Thanks, Professor.
All right, see you later. Bye. Oh, yeah, it's probably best to send it to me my email. If it won't work, then break it up into individual pieces because those files can be very large. So, all right, anyone else?
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
I also have you for the pre-calc class on Wednesdays.
Right.
Is the midterm due tonight or tomorrow night?
God, let me look at the announcements. I don't remember off the top of my head.
It's due tomorrow. Sorry, I just had the same class. You said
right.
it was on the 20th on Wednesday at midnight.
There. Okay, so I'm hoping that I put it Wednesday, the 20th at midnight. Good, perfect. Yeah, I don't always remember to make that announcement. It's very annoying. Yeah, tomorrow night at midnight. That should be that gives you like another day and a half, 2 days basically. So you should be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? All right. Oh, okay. So I guess we have to wait. Everybody's not logged off. I don't know what's holding them up. Well, all right. I'll tell you what, I can just basically close the door for them. I don't know what's going on, so I'm gonna take them out of the meeting. If they need to ask me a question, they can ask me later on. All right, so go ahead.
Hi, Professor. I was gonna say, could we just like make another Zoom meeting like we usually do when it's not recorded?
You mean when do you want to do it?
But no, like right now. I mean, because I know it's still recording. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. I didn't get what we were getting at. Okay, let me start. Well, I don't remember how to do this. If I stop the sharing, I don't think you'll be able to discuss this any further, or maybe. Well, first we'll start by pausing the share. If I hit stop share, I think it's going to throw you. Well, maybe not. Are you still there?
I'm still here.
No, it's still recording.